Welcome to Inside the Director Circle and this episode on helping your team work together more effectively. I'm Jason Langford-Brown, your host, founder of the Director Circle and practicing business advisor and coaching psychologist. In the last episode, we focused on hiring for a high-performing team, but now your team is in place, how do you as a leader help them be more effective? In this episode, we're going to share some insights and some proven factors that can help you with this challenge. To help us, as always, we're delighted to welcome one of our knowledge partners from the Director Circle to add some expertise to the subject. Today we are joined again by Joe Keeler, Managing Director of Belbin, one of the world's leading and probably most respected behavioural and team profiling providers. And to add a practical element to the discussion, our business leader members from the Director Circle today are Matt Jones, serial scale-up businessman and founder and Managing Director of Oxbridge, a leading online college and edtech business. Alongside him, Naeem Alviasinda, founder and managing director of Notepad, award-winning and one of the fastest growing branded agencies in the UK. And just very quickly, before we get into the discussion, remember this is just a snapshot of what happens within our business leader community at the Director Circle. So if you want to get more involved, we want more insights, tools or support, visit directors-circle.com and click join the community. Okay. So as a bit of a starter to today's conversation, I thought we'd normally start with our knowledge partner, but I thought today we'd start with our members. And in terms of actually helping your team to work effectively, Naeem, for you, what are the challenges? What are the challenges of getting your team to work effectively?
I think the greatest challenge in I don't know if it's just our industry, but certainly it seems to be prevalent in our industry, is that the work we do is kind of judged by how creative we are. So our creativity is our main metric. It's the thing we sell. You can do the work, but if the work's rubbish, then it doesn't have an impact. So we have to tread that fine line between, because we sell time as a business, that we are an agency model. We have to tread that line between selling the right amount of time to give the team the time they need and the structure they need to do their best creative work productively. And I think where our industry falls down all the time, and something that is kind of our mission really to try and solve, is that the processes are rubbish typically in agencies. They haven't sold enough time to get the job done. So the only solution is to ask people to work until midnight, and I'm a firm believer that past 40, 45 hours a week, your creativity just drops off a cliff anyway. So beyond, that third or fourth long day of the week, the work is inevitably going to spiral. So I think that's my greatest challenge actually in growing Notepad is how do you keep it to a sensible number of hours in terms of the working week, while also creating an environment that really does gently but persuasively push people creatively to do their best work. That's the fine line that we tread. I'd say that's the biggest challenge.
Yes, it's ultimately a productivity challenge there, really.
Yeah, that's it. How do you keep people productive and also productive in what is very highly demanding work? It's not process or kind of just factory work. Nothing wrong with factory work, but it's very much it's continual problem solving, and there's never, while there are similarities in projects, there's never a set way of doing things. We kind of always have to be continually challenging ourselves and each other, and that's the bit I struggle with the most, I think. And we're very good at it. We've never worked weekends. We very rarely work past sort of 5:30, but there are times when we still have to, work super, super hard against pressure, and that's normally where we've either not found the solution or we've had some falling down in process. So yeah, I think it's the greatest challenge for us is being productive, but doing it in a healthy way.
And it's interesting because maybe I'll push this back to Joe, but I think often productivity can come from people trying to do many things, but they're not good at everything. And going back to our conversation in the last podcast about that blend of types to make a highly effective team. For you, Joe, is there something in this about actually are people spending the time on the things that suits them best behaviourally to make them most productive? I don't know if that resonated with you as it did with me.
Oh, no, absolutely. And there's been a lot of work, hasn't there, been done via, I think, Gallup on employee engagement. And they say if somebody is allowed to play a role which resonates with their strengths at least once a day, they're going to be 6 times more engaged. And by engaged, it means being so active when you're, with a team, looking for extra work, looking for different ways to do things. And so if we can seem to align the work with people's strengths, and in our way we call them about behavioural strengths, it is going to be one of those things that are going to help towards that productivity. If people, for example, keep giving me work that it requires, lots of attention to detail and lots of really critical stuff to make sure there's no mistakes. If I did that every day, well, one, the company wouldn't survive because I can't do it. But two, I'm not being very productive. But I know somebody else actually who would be, and that's the key thing, isn't it? Knowing your strengths, but also the strengths of other people, so that you can delegate accordingly.
No, I think you're right, because I think even in people doing the same role, and in Naeem's case, obviously creatives, they're going to have different strengths, different behaviors. And you're right, because we do know psychologically, we're energized by our strengths. And of course, when you're energized, you're in flow, and so you're just smashing it out because you're just loving it. When we can do the stuff that doesn't energize us, but you're right, it's draining, it's exhausting, and ultimately it will start to drain our productivity. I think that's a really interesting insight to sort of, for people to maybe try and map that out. For you, Matt, what's the problem for you in terms of running a highly effective team? What problems or challenges do you face?
I think it's, it goes outside of just running a team, really. It's running an organisation. And over the last few years, we've been recruiting like crazy. So we've had a lot of new faces come through that door. And I think the biggest challenge for me is keeping people, especially new people, aligned on the vision and mission of the business, and ultimately on the goals of the business as well, and making sure that everyone, in that choir of an organisation is singing along the same lines, actually, and across departments. Now, that's traditionally, my understanding is that's very difficult in businesses, and keeping different departments with slightly different goals and that kind of thing aligned and working together. So that has been a real challenge for me. And, as I say, with a lot of new faces comes those problems of distilling culture out really quickly, and how ultimately that then affects the culture of the business moving forward, because of course culture is not a fixed thing, it's something that changes over time. So certainly biggest challenge is keeping people aligned to the company goals.
Yeah. And Matt, for you, any sort of insights in terms of how you've done that over the years, historically, more recently, how it's adapted or changed, or even where you still not quite got it right, if that's...
Absolutely, yeah. We keep picking on me for not getting things right.
I just know you're honest, Matt, that's all.
Absolutely. Look, things, when you're running a business, things go right and wrong every day. And ultimately, you have to learn from those mistakes and learn from the things that are going wrong. I think for me, some of the solutions, and these aren't by any means an extensive list, but you have to make sure that the goals of the business are really closely tied to those team priorities. And you have to make sure that those roles are really well defined, so people know what they're doing and how that implements ultimately to business goals. And more than anything, make sure people are communicating, because people love to be siloed. And although outwardly people talk about wanting to communicate and wanting to be effective at that, I think it's really important to instill a culture of open communication, as long as it's respectful, to challenge as well when they're not hearing, things that are in line with company culture and behaviours. But keeping that, aligned across departments is really, really important, and it is a real challenge in any business.
I think that's great advice, Matt. And I just wanted to pick up, if I could, just on that team goals point, because I see with a lot of businesses I work with, they're really focused on the organisational goals, and they're really focused. Caveat: not very good at individual goals, performance management. Everyone talks about it. I'm not sure everyone does it that well. But of course, nearly all those people are working within a team. Yet, if you are asked to see team goals, you can very, very, very rarely get sight of those. So I think that's really interesting that you're talking about not just that alignment, but also actually getting team goals to the fore, because people do work in teams ultimately, don't they? So I think that's really, really interesting. I also like the fact you picked up on communication, because that's one of the elements in our high performing team framework. And I think there's no doubt that really high performing teams are always communicating, arguably over communicating. And outside of that, I wanted to pick up on another element of our framework, which is around disagreement, because we talked in the last podcast about having a blend of types, but how that can create a prickly team. And of course, that can then start to create quite a disagreement, which for those that are maybe more mature, see as a positive thing. But I think for many people, they find that very uncomfortable. And then you lend that into where, I know for me, I think really high performing teams ultimately trust each other. So maybe, Joe, can I come to you on this one really? How do we help people with that journey of embracing a prickly team and the disagreement it brings, which is, I think, necessary, and taking that onto a journey of trust?
you need disagreement for teams to be at their best. You need disagreement for teams to perform. And we've all got this sort of image, haven't we, that a high performing team is one that's all sort of happy and having tea together and laughing. No. For a team to be truly high performing, there needs to be disagreements because you are seeing things from lots and lots of different perspectives. And that's again where the communication comes in. People say, we need to communicate. Well, how do you communicate? Because if we're all different, we're going to be communicating in different ways, some of which are easier to hear, easier to communicate back with than others. So it's finding out more about the differences in communication, how to get the most out of everybody, bearing that in mind, and knowing that actually you want it to be as quickly as possible. But you can only really do that if there's trust. Because people are only ever going to disagree with you or say, hang on a minute, have you thought about this? If they feel that the culture is there to allow them to do so, the trust is there for them to be able to do so. And this doesn't happen overnight. This is something that you have to constantly work at. In fact, building high performing teams isn't a tick list. It's something that you have to constantly keep working at because everything changes, doesn't it? Goalposts change, objectives change, people change. And what you may have had 6 months ago may not be what you have now. So it's really important. But yeah, the prickly teams, disagreement, critical, as long as actually there's enough trust or psychological safety for people to be able to do that.
And it's interesting you mentioned at the end there psychological safety on trust, because I think for me, I think that's a big. I always think, what can leaders be doing practically to start to foster trust? And trust in itself is a big subject. But psychological safety, I love that term that's being used now, because I think for most ordinary people working in a business under us in teams, they're frightened, aren't they? They're scared that am I going to get in trouble? Am I going to get told off? Am I going to get told to get back in my box if I speak out, and don't say yes to everything the boss says. So it is about psychological safety. It is about, so as leaders, there are things we can do, I suspect. Maybe I'll come to you now, Matt, because I know this is a bit of a subject for you, things we can do to make people feel safe and able to speak up and challenge without fear of something happening to them they don't want to happen. Have you got a view on that, Matt?
So I think it's obviously a really complicated subject and people make careers out of this, but really, really simply, it's about that safety of people feeling like they can make a mistake and it's okay. I mean, ultimately, I don't run a nuclear power station. So if someone makes a mistake, it's not going to be that bad. So actually, I encourage and promote, as long as it's not going to cause massive problems, it's okay to make a few mistakes. I make mistakes all day, every day. And the point being is when a mistake's made, it's empowering people to, put their hand up and say, look, I've made this mistake and here's the outcome of it. And then we talk about what we can learn from that. But really, when people feel empowered to get on with the job and they're safe in doing so, someone that says to me, I've got an idea, but it's a bit stupid. And I stop them there and say, no idea is stupid. We want to hear these things. And look, some of the greatest ideas in the world came from what people thought were crazy ideas, and that's a really empowering thing. So I really try and promote that with any organisation that I am involved in. But I think it allows people to bring their full selves to the job as well, and really feel, when they feel comfortable, you start to get the full person. A lot of people are quite guarded in a job. They feel like they can't look stupid or anything like that. And as long as people are being professional, then, is any idea a bad idea? Not usually.
Normally it's a better one. I suppose on ideas, Naeem, we ought to come to you really in terms of how do you foster that disagreement in a creative environment? Because I would think that if you didn't have some disagreement around ideas, then I'm not sure you'd even be in business. Would that be fair?
No, I'm fascinated by the subject of ideas. I think one of it's a perfect example really of what we do, I think, to try and create that level of trust is I have terrible ideas all the time and I will actively share them openly, and say, I think this might be terrible, but what do you think, kind of thing. And there's that wonderful old, story the sacrificial pancake. So on pancake day, when you're making pancakes, the first one is always rubbish before you get into the rhythm of being able to flip properly, or before the pan has the right level of slickness to it to flip a pancake. So you have to get that bad one out of the way first for good ideas to happen. And I think you're absolutely right. So much of that is linked to how safe people feel, whether they can have that absurd idea and share it confidently. And it's something that I've seen kind of really in a telling way when we hire people, particularly from a corporate environment, who've come into agency land, and where agency land ideas flow freely. We probably have too many ideas. We all have huge kind of belief in our own ideas, but they will be very quiet to start with, and actually it's one of those things that over time they'll start to realize that actually it's okay just to suggest something even if you think it's stupid, because then it often leads on to better ideas. It's kind of we see it as a cyclical thing. It doesn't happen at once. It kind of happens when you start momentum. That's the important thing of sharing ideas.
Yeah, that's lovely. I love that notion of actually, putting yourself out there and being authentic, being vulnerable, and making those mistakes, or yourself, so people can see that, and then back that with mats or giving people permission. I think is a really powerful way to start to address that challenge of building trust. I just wanted to make sure we touched on one other thing just before we finish today, which is, for me, I think we talked about the best teams. They aren't just a range of the best skills, they are a blend of behaviors. And I think I mentioned in our last podcast that they also typically tend to have very, very high levels of EQ. And I think this is a spin-off of that whole piece around disagreement and trust. I think when there's a lot of disagreement in a team and we've got a prickly team, it takes a group of people with fairly high emotional intelligence to navigate that at a social level. So I just wondered, Joe, what your view on that? Do you see that as a real key element of a high performing team, that high level of EQ?
Absolutely. It's high amount of EQ, it is understanding, but that starts understanding yourself, doesn't it? And that's where it really starts. And understanding not just how you see yourself, but how others see you, getting that external reference as well, which builds up these levels of EQ. And the more we understand the effect we have on others, the more that we understand about how we sometimes vary the effect that we have on others. It's critical for teams. You do get it the more team matures, because it's all situational, as well as leadership situational, your teamwork is situational. You do find that level of EQ does really come into its own. But what I would say in all of this, one interesting thing is that communication, prickly teams, trust, psychological safety, all of these things need to become from within the team, which is another area of EQ as well, because very often we as leaders feel that we need to impart, this is what our culture is, this is what we do, so and so forth, and therefore the team will work well. One of the things that we recommend is when you have a new starter, for example, is don't just have a top-down approach with them to make the most of them within a team. Make sure they spend time one-to-one. We've been talking about how do you build up that communication and understand and appreciate difference. Have lots and lots of one-to-ones, but within team members, not just always from above. And also, when you have these different departments, well, why not arrange some official one-to-ones with people in different departments as well, to understand a bit more how they work? Then you get more of a mature team, you get more of a mature person understanding the benefits of everybody. It's not being enforced upon them, and therefore you have that culture of sharing, and prickliness is absolutely fine. Psychological safety really, really does start to move. So that, and with the EQ, really critical, I think, with getting high-performing teams together.
Yeah, Joe, I've heard you talk about this before, and if you don't mind me just adding to that, because I'll use your words. Is that you've talked in the past about ultimately when teams start to fall apart after we've been through that that honeymoon period, and we go through the forming, storming, norming, if you want to use that kind of psychology language. Once they start to piss each other off, it's about the behaviours. It's not about because you're not capable of doing your job. So I loved what you said in that context before about actually having those one-to-ones and almost saying to people, you need to be aware how I might piss you off in the future. Let's have a conversation about that.
We need to know, don't we? I mean, if you've got two people with high resource investigator behaviour, where they're just really talkative and chatty and enthusiastic and lots of ideas, they need to know that they're probably going to have a brilliant time at work, but they're not going to be very productive. And they need to have that conversation right at the very beginning. So just because we're getting on doesn't actually mean we're probably doing the work that needs to be done. So let's have that conversation. Or perhaps somebody who's high team worker, who's got that caring, empathy, and high shaper. Somebody just wants to get it done. Know that at some point, again, they're the opposite ends of the spectrum. Knowing that is key. Not avoiding that, but knowing that as soon as you can, and putting together those strategies to be able to make the most of that relationship and therefore the most of that team.
Yes, because I get it on the table right from the beginning. And I think just to share some of my own experience, I've seen that carried on in a couple of very successful businesses where they absolutely do that. And then using Belbin or any other profiling tool, they keep those alive in the business. And I've been in offices. In fact, one of my own teams did this to me a few years ago. We did some profiling and they all had their profiles printed on their desk, but they'd added to it, I'm a this. I won't give away the profile they use. I'm a this, so talk to me like this. I'm a this, so don't do this. And I thought that was really powerful because it was constantly alive the whole time they were working, which was great. It's always like a constant reminder, which is brilliant. Naeem, just want to finish off just from your perspective, just where you've had that person in your team, and I'm kind of guessing you have, where that emotional intelligence has been missing and they haven't had that self-awareness or their impact on others. You know, what that's done and where that's been difficult for you. Anything you can quickly share with us for a moment or so?
It's hard, isn't it? Because it's not like emotional intelligence is something you can just tell someone to have more of, as much as I'd love to be able to do that. So when we've had that, we've definitely experienced that situation. It's either going to go one of two ways. It's either going to come to a point where you realize they're never going to have the empathy that's needed to be in the role they're in. So it's actually fairer to them to move them out of the business and ask them to do something else. Or you go on a really long period of sort of performance management and try and get them to start seeing things from other people's perspectives. And I think they're depending on the case of the person, they are both options. Sometimes it's impossible, to teach people empathy and to help them understand. But it's certainly one of the things that we've learned. Actually, I totally agree that particularly in our industry, empathy is paramount, really, because we're trying to put ourselves into the position of solving problems for other businesses. So we have to fully understand the problem and what that means for the business itself. And if you don't have that, then our industry would be a very challenging place to work. So I think when it comes to trying to improve people's empathy, it's either go on a long journey to try and do it or get rid of them.
Yeah, well, and I think you're right. I think that we know we can help people build their EQ. Everyone can build their EQ. The question is whether they want to. And I think the question that you tap into there is how far do they need to go for it to be functional in your business? And it's a question of then have we got the time and resource to bridge that gap almost, isn't it, really? And then I think we're into where Matt was talking in the original podcast around hiring for a high performing team. Assuming we've hired slow and got a good chance of getting it right. When it isn't working, we need to fire fast, because then we get into that cancerous piece that Matt was talking about. Matt, for you, Matt, any final insights for you in terms of the emotional intelligence side? Is it something that resonates with you, or?
Absolutely. So, by far the takeaway bit of advice is EQ over IQ all day, every day. And in fact, in my own interview process, I'm probably giving away too many secrets here, but in my own interview process, it's unlikely I've got the person's CV in front of me for the first meet, actually, because I'm figuring out their EQ and all of those other things that, look, the reality is if we've read their CV, we know they can do the job. It's just whether they can do the job with us is essentially what I'm looking for. So actually EQ over IQ all day, every day.
Great. Thank you, Matt. And I think probably at that point, we're going to need to wrap up today. I think I'm really delighted. I think we did promise to give people some factors, but I think we've touched all the factors over this podcast and the podcast previously. We always talk about, a high performing team needs focus, it needs direction, it needs a plan to achieve what it needs to achieve, which I think we've touched in some areas there. We've talked about the blend of types and that need for disagreement. The communication piece for me is critical, and obviously emotional intelligence definitely is a factor of those really high performing teams. But ultimately you get, you've got it right when they trust each other. I think that's kind of the end point. So thank you all for sort of bringing some of those elements to life for us. In terms of the next episode, we're going to be able to change the subject. We're going to move it in to a conversation around highly effective communication. I'm delighted to be welcoming Dr. Brian Glabowski, who's the inventor of AQ, not EQ, AQ, which is all about answer intelligence. I won't give too much away here, but a really seminal piece of work that I think you'll really enjoy. But before then, if there's any more that people want on this subject around high-performing teams, again, reach out to Joe at Belwin. I'm sure they'd be delighted to help you. One of our knowledge partners, Lucid, is one of their accredited partners, so lucid-group.com also will be more than happy to assist with anything around this high-performing team area. But in the meantime, thank you for listening to Inside the Director's Circle.